The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing, hungry and cruel, tearing across the high plains with a fury that turned the afternoon into a twilight of swirling white. James Rutherford pulled his hat lower and hunched deeper into his sheepskin coat, his horse stepping carefully through snow that had already climbed past its fetlocks. He shouldn't have been out here, not in this weather, but the cattle wouldn't bring themselves down from the high pastures, and winter in Wyoming territory waited for no man's convenience. He'd been riding for hours, his face raw from the wind, ice crystals forming in his mustache with each breath. The storm had come up faster than he'd expected, rolling over the peaks like an avalanche of cloud and fury. Now visibility had shrunk to perhaps 20 yards, and James was beginning to wonder if he'd made a fatal mistake. Men had frozen to death in storms like this, found weeks later when the snow melted, their horses standing guard over their bodies like patient sentinels. It was the horse that noticed her first. The bay gelding's ears pricked forward, and it whinnied softly, a sound almost lost in the howling wind. James squinted through the snow, seeing nothing at first but white chaos. Then he saw movement, a dark shape against the endless white, something that didn't belong to the pattern of wind, bent sage and snow-laden rocks. He urged his horse forward, and the shape resolved itself into a person, a figure on their knees in the snow, wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket or hide. As he drew closer, he could see it was a woman, her long black hair whipping in the wind, her face turned up toward him with an expression that combined hope and desperation in equal measure. "Please," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the storm, "please, take me with you. I can't walk any more." James dismounted immediately, his boots sinking deep into the snow. Up close, he could see she was a native woman, probably Shoshone from this part of the territory, though he wasn't certain. Her deerskin dress was soaked through, and the buffalo robe wrapped around her shoulders was heavy with snow. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and she was shaking so violently that he could see it even through her attempts to hold herself still. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Where's your horse?" "Gone," she said through chattering teeth. "Spooked by a cougar 2 days ago. I've been walking, trying to reach the winter camp, but the storm—" She gestured weakly at the white fury around them. "I can't feel my feet anymore." James didn't hesitate. He'd heard enough stories about people who'd given up in storms like this, who'd simply sat down in the snow and never gotten up again. This woman was dangerously close to that point. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders over the buffalo robe, ignoring her weak protests. "We need to get you warm," he said. "Can you stand if I help you?" She tried, but her legs buckled immediately. James caught her before she fell face first into the snow. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, or perhaps it was just the adrenaline giving him strength. He managed to get her onto his horse, settling her in the saddle, then swung up behind her, pulling her back against his chest. "There's a line shack about a mile east of here," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure she could hear him over the wind. "We'll shelter there until the storm passes." She nodded weakly, and he could feel her trembling against him. He kicked the horse into motion, guiding it with his knees, one arm wrapped around the woman to keep her from falling, the other hand gripping the reins. The wind fought them every step, and more than once James wondered if he'd made the right choice. It would have been safer, perhaps, to dig a snow cave and wait out the worst of the storm. But she needed warmth, real warmth, and the shack had a stove if he could get a fire going. The journey seemed to take hours, though it was probably only 40 minutes. Time had a strange quality in storms like this, stretching and compressing in ways that defied normal measurement. The woman in his arms had stopped shaking, which worried him more than the trembling had. He kept talking to her, nonsense mostly, just to keep her conscious. "Stay with me now," he said. "We're almost there. You're going to be fine. What's your name? Can you tell me your name?" "Ayanna," she murmured, so quietly he almost missed it. "That's pretty," he said. "I'm James Rutherford. I work the Broken J Ranch, about 10 miles south of here. You just hold on, Ayanna. We're almost there." The line shack materialized out of the snow like a benediction, a small dark shape that grew more solid as they approached. It was a rough structure, barely more than a cabin really, built for exactly this purpose, to give cowboys shelter when they were working the high pastures. James had been in it a dozen times, knew exactly where the door was even in this visibility. He dismounted, then carefully lifted Ayanna down. She couldn't stand on her own, so he propped her against the horse while he wrestled with the door. The latch was frozen, of course, and it took him precious minutes to get it open, minutes during which he could feel Ayanna slumping further against the horse's shoulder. The interior was dark and cold, but at least it blocked the wind. James got Ayanna inside, laying her on the single bunk against the wall, then went back for his horse. He led it to the small lean-to attached to the shack, unsaddled it quickly, and made sure it had access to the hay stored there. The horse would be fine, James knew. It was Ayanna he was worried about. Back inside, he shut the door against the storm and fumbled for the matches he knew were kept on the shelf beside the door. His fingers were numb, making the simple task difficult, but finally he got one lit. The lamp on the table caught with a warm glow that seemed impossibly bright after the white fury outside. In the lamplight, he could see Ayanna more clearly, and what he saw made his heart sink. Her lips were deeply blue now, her face pale beneath her brown skin. Her eyes were closed, and he couldn't tell if she was unconscious or simply exhausted. Her clothing was frozen stiff in places where the wet leather had been exposed to the wind. The stove was his first priority. Thankfully, someone had left kindling and a few logs beside it. James's hands shook as he built the fire, but his father had taught him well, and soon flames were crackling in the belly of the small iron stove. He opened the damper wide, wanting heat more than efficiency. Then he turned to Ayanna. She needed to get out of those wet clothes, but James hesitated, acutely aware of propriety even in this desperate situation. Still, propriety wouldn't save her life, and hypothermia would kill her if he didn't act. "Ayanna," he said, touching her shoulder gently. "Ayanna, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, cold. She whispered, "I know, but I need to get these wet things off you. Do you understand?" She nodded slightly, and that was permission enough. As carefully and respectfully as he could, James helped her out of the wet deerskin dress and the soaked buffalo robe. There were blankets in the trunk at the foot of the bunk, and he wrapped her in all of them, then added his own bedroll for good measure. Her feet were what worried him most. They were pale and waxy looking, the toes darkened in a way that made him fear frostbite. He rubbed them gently, trying to restore circulation, working his way up her legs through the blankets. Gradually, color began to return, and she cried out softly as feeling came back with the painful prickling of returning blood flow. It was a good sign, James knew. It meant she wasn't too far gone. The storm raged outside, the wind howling around the corners of the shack like wolves, but inside the temperature was slowly rising. James hung Ayanna's wet clothes near the stove to dry, then turned his attention to making something warm for her to drink. There was coffee in the supplies and a pot to heat water in. It wasn't much, but it would be something. While the water heated, he sat on the edge of the bunk, watching Ayanna. Her eyes were open now, more focused, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," James replied, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. There were men who would have ridden right past her, either out of fear or prejudice or simple self-preservation. "Not anyone," she said. "There are many who would have left me there." She was right, and they both knew it. The relationship between white settlers and the native peoples in Wyoming Territory was complex and often hostile. The Indian Wars were still within living memory, and distrust ran deep on both sides. "What were you doing out there?" James asked. "You said you were trying to reach your winter camp." Ayanna nodded, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. "My family's camp is in the valley, about 15 miles north. I had been visiting my grandmother at the reservation, helping her through a sickness. When she was well enough, I started back. But my horse," she trailed off, her eyes distant. "I thought I could make it on foot before the storm hit. I was wrong. You almost made it," James said. "That's something. 15 miles in this terrain, that's no small feat." The water boiled, and he poured 2 cups of coffee, strong and black. He helped Ayanna sit up enough to drink, supporting her with one arm while she held the tin cup with both hands, her fingers still clumsy with cold. She sipped slowly, and James could see the warmth spreading through her as the hot liquid made its way down. "What about you?" she asked. "Why were you out in this storm?" "Cattle," James said simply. "We've got a herd up in the high pastures, and they needed to be brought down before winter set in proper. I was scouting the area when the storm hit." "That was foolish," Ayanna said, but there was no judgment in her voice, only statement of fact. James laughed, surprising himself. "I reckon it was, but sometimes foolishness is part of the job." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the storm. The shack was warming nicely now, the stove putting out good heat. James could feel exhaustion creeping up on him, the adrenaline of the rescue draining away and leaving him hollow. But he didn't want to sleep, not yet. Ayanna was still recovering, and he wanted to make sure she was truly out of danger before he let his guard down. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said, as much to keep himself awake as to keep her talking. "The one you were visiting." Ayanna's face softened. "She is one of the elders, very wise. She knows the old stories, the old ways. When I was a child, she would tell me tales of the spirits in the mountains, of Coyote the trickster, of how the world was made. She is teaching me the healing arts, which plants can cure and which can harm." "Sounds like a remarkable woman," James said. "She is. She survived the long march to the reservation, survived losing my grandfather to the sickness that swept through the camps. She has seen much sorrow, but she remains strong." Ayanna paused, looking at James with those dark, intelligent eyes. "She always told me that not all white men are enemies, that there is good and bad in all peoples. I think she would like you." James felt unexpectedly moved by this. "I'd be honored to meet her someday." "Perhaps you will," Ayanna said. "If we survive this storm, we'll survive it," James said with more confidence than he felt. "This shack has weathered worse, and so have we." Outside, the wind continued its assault, but inside the small shelter, a fragile peace had settled. James found some jerky and hardtack in the supplies, and they shared a simple meal, talking quietly about their lives, their families, their hopes. James learned that Ayanna had been married once, but her husband had died in a hunting accident 3 years ago. She had no children, which she spoke of with quiet sadness. In turn, James told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about following the cattle north to Wyoming, about his dreams of one day having his own spread. He found himself speaking more openly than he usually did, perhaps because the storm had created a strange intimacy. a sense that they existed outside the normal rules and constraints of the world. As night fell, though it was hard to tell with the storm blocking out any hint of the sky, James convinced Ayanna to try to sleep. She protested weakly, saying she was fine, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He helped her lie back down, making sure she was wrapped warmly in the blankets. "What about you?" she asked. "You need rest too." "I'll keep the fire going," James said. "I'll rest later." But despite his intentions, exhaustion claimed him. He dozed in the chair by the stove, waking periodically to add wood to the fire, checking on Ayanna to make sure she was still breathing steadily, still warm. Each time he woke, the storm seemed just as fierce as before, the wind never letting up, the snow piling higher against the walls of the shack. Sometime deep in the night, he woke to find Ayanna watching him from the bunk. "You should rest properly," she said. "There's room here, and you'll freeze sitting in that chair if the fire goes out." James hesitated, but she was right. The cold was seeping into his bones, and he needed real rest if he was going to be any use tomorrow. He added more wood to the stove, then lay down on the very edge of the bunk, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Ayanna was still wrapped in most of the blankets, but she shared one with him, and the shared warmth was immediately comforting. "Thank you," he murmured. "No," she replied softly. "Thank you for stopping, for caring, for seeing me as a person worth saving." James wanted to say that of course she was worth saving, that anyone would be, but the words stuck in his throat because they both knew the world didn't always work that way. Instead, he simply said, "Sleep well, Ayanna. Sleep well, James." He woke to pale light filtering through the gaps in the shack's walls and the blessed sound of silence. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed. James rose carefully, not wanting to wake Ayanna, and went to the door. When he opened it, he had to push against a drift that had piled up against the entrance. But once he got it open, he was greeted by a landscape of pristine white, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun was just rising, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. It was breathtakingly beautiful, the kind of beauty that made all the hardship seem worthwhile. His horse nickered a greeting from the lean-to, and James checked on it, finding it none the worse for wear despite the ordeal. When he returned to the shack, Ayanna was awake, sitting up wrapped in the blankets. Her color had returned fully, and though she still looked tired, the dangerous pallor was gone. "The storm has passed," James announced unnecessarily. "Yes," Ayanna said. "I can hear the silence. It is a good sound." Her clothes had dried by the fire overnight, and James turned his back while she dressed, giving her privacy. When she was ready, they shared the last of the coffee and some more hardtack, a meager breakfast, but enough to give them energy for what came next. "I need to try to reach my family," Ayanna said. "They will be worried." "I'll take you," James said immediately. "You're not walking anywhere on those feet for a few days at least, and the snow is too deep anyway." She looked like she might argue, but instead she simply nodded. "Thank you again." The journey to Ayanna's camp took most of the day. The snow was deep, and James's horse struggled at times, but the animal was strong and determined. Ayanna rode in front of him again, but this time she wasn't trembling with cold. Instead, she pointed out landmarks, guiding him through terrain that was utterly transformed by the snow. They talked as they rode, continuing the conversations from the night before, building on the unexpected friendship that had formed in that small shack during the howling storm. James learned more about Ayanna's life, about the struggles her people faced, about the constant pressure to give up their ways and adopt the customs of the white settlers. Ayanna, in turn, learned about James's lonely life on the range, about his estrangement from his family back in Texas, about the woman he'd loved once, who'd married another man. When they finally reached the winter camp, it was late afternoon. The camp was a collection of tipis and rough cabins in a sheltered valley, smoke rising from fires into the clear, cold air. People came running when they saw them approach, and suddenly Ayanna was surrounded by family, everyone talking at once in a language James didn't understand. An older man, his face weathered and wise, approached James. "You brought our daughter home," he said in accented but clear English. "We are grateful. She would have made it on her own if not for the storm," James said, suddenly shy in the face of so much attention. "Perhaps," the man said, "but perhaps not. Either way, you are welcome here. Will you stay, share our food, warm yourself by our fire?" James glanced at Ayanna, who was talking animatedly with an elderly woman who must have been the grandmother she'd spoken of. She caught his eye and smiled, nodding encouragingly. "I'd be honored," James said. He stayed for 2 days in the end, sleeping in the tipi of Ayanna's family, sharing their food, listening to their stories. The old grandmother, whose name was Nasha, did indeed take a liking to him, and she spent hours teaching him about the healing properties of local plants, occasionally translating through Ayanna. When his understanding failed, on the morning he left, riding back toward the Broken Jay with a pack of food the camp had pressed on him, Ayanna walked with him to the edge of the camp. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "I think so," James said. "I know where you are now, and something tells me our paths were meant to cross. The storm brought us together," Ayanna said. "Perhaps it was meant to teach us something. Perhaps," James agreed, "that people are just people, no matter what they look like or where they come from. That kindness matters more than we think." "Those are good lessons," Ayanna said. She reached up and touched his face gently, a gesture of affection that needed no translation. "Go safely, James Rutherford, and come back when you can." "I will," he promised. As he rode away, James turned back once to see Ayanna standing at the edge of the camp, silhouetted against the brilliant white of the snow, her hand raised in farewell. He raised his own hand in response, then turned his horse south toward the ranch. The world looked different to him now, the same landscape he'd ridden through 1,000 times, transformed by something more profound than snow. He'd always thought of himself as a fair man, not given to the prejudices that plagued so many of his contemporaries. But he realized now that there was a difference between not hating and actually seeing, actually knowing, actually understanding. In the years that followed, James did return to the winter camp, and not just once, but many times. He and Ayanna became close friends, a friendship that raised eyebrows on both sides, but endured none the less. She taught him much about her people's ways, about living in harmony with the land rather than always fighting against it. He, in turn, helped her navigate the complex world of treaties and government agents, using his status as a white man to advocate for fair treatment where his words might carry weight that hers would not. Sometimes, when James found himself struggling with the loneliness of ranch life or the seeming futility of trying to bridge two worlds that seemed determined to remain separate, he would think back to that howling storm, to the moment when he'd seen a figure kneeling in the snow and made the simple human choice to stop and help. Such a small decision, really, taking only seconds to make, but it had changed the course of his life entirely. He never did get his own ranch. Instead, he eventually partnered with Ayanna's family, helping them establish a small cattle operation on their land, teaching them the business while learning from them about sustainable ways of managing the herd. It wasn't the life he'd imagined as a young man riding north from Texas, but it was a good life, rich with friendship and purpose, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful. And on winter nights, when the wind howled around the cabin he'd built at the edge of the valley, James would sometimes remember that smaller shack, the storm that had brought two strangers together, and the simple plea that had started it all. "Please, take Me with you. I can't walk any more. He had taken her with him in a way, not just that day, but in all the days that followed, and in doing so he had found his own way home, to a place he hadn't even known he was looking for, where the measure of a person wasn't the color of their skin or the language they spoke, but the content of their character and the kindness in their heart. The storm had been fierce, but it had passed, as all storms do. What remained was the choice they'd made in its midst, the choice to see each other's humanity despite everything that might have kept them apart. That choice had made all the difference, warming them against winters far colder than any Wyoming storm could ever bring.